You're listening to Veterans for Recovery, a podcast that unpacks all things recovery within our extended military family. Join your host, retired Major John Donovan, a noted author, lecturer, and person in long-term recovery from substance use disorder, as he and his guests will break down current trending topics and research, along with all things recovery related to increasing recovery resilience and recovery capital within our veteran and service member communities. Now here's your host, Major John Donovan.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Veterans for Recovery. This is a podcast that looks at all things pertaining to our veterans, service members, and their family members who are in recovery or seeking recovery. I'm John Donovan, a retired major of the U.S. Army, and I'm a person in long-term recovery. With me today is my guest, Sean Partch. Today, Sean and I will explore what recovery means and how it impacts our lives. Sean, welcome to the show, and thank you for being with us today.
So thank you, JD. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into your recovery journey, your recovery story, and what you're doing right now for the recovery community, which is really exciting. First, just tell us a little bit about your background, your education, your profession.
Sure. So, well, my name is Sean Partch. I'm a person in long-term recovery. Coming up in February, I'll have 8 years. I'm also a person that has a history of justice involvement. Some people ask, what does that mean? It's really a politically correct way of saying I've been in prison or jail. Um, my substance use disorder, the using and drinking started at a young age, probably teens. I stayed, on a daily use of some, form of alcohol or drug for most of all of my youth into my adulthood. Really, I spent about 30 years in substance use disorder, and it led me to eventually, spend time in the Department of Corrections in Minnesota. I call it the Minnesota Airbnb. And, that's kind of what led up to me. I had exposure to Alcoholics Anonymous, years ago, and some 12-step recovery. And this last time that I had gone into the Department of Corrections, I had made a decision that I just wanted to do something different. And it led me to, upon release, going back to work full time at a local foundry here. And with my history, it was one of the only places that I could find that, that paid enough to really live comfortably and that would accept somebody with my history. And then John, our host here, being my sponsor, said, well, hey, there's this opportunity over at Recovery Community Network in St. Cloud for somebody who's got some justice involvement. And jokingly, I said, well, I can probably make some phone calls. And John said, no, you need to go over there and meet with our now director, Katie Blue. And really that started my path that I'm on now to working in recovery full time. And the opportunities that have been made available are just, I can't be grateful enough for all the chances that I've been given and all the opportunities that I've had now working with the RCN.
Well, that's an incredible recovery story, recovery journey, and there's so much to unpackage there. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of it in just this half-hour podcast, but I do want to touch on a couple of things. One, you talked about felon-friendly employment and how you were working with one employer that was willing to overlook a criminal background. I was just watching a new Netflix series where one person said, we're the only employer within this geographic area that employs people who have been through the justice system. Is getting employment, is that a major obstacle for people who have been justice involved and are now in active recovery?
So I can tell you this, John, 10 years ago, it definitely was absolutely one of the biggest barriers. There has been a paradigm shift with employers being more willing to work with somebody that has a history of justice involvement. It's always a challenge. I myself, when I first got released from the Department of Corrections, probably put in about 20 applications, and I would get denied, and I would get denied. And because you don't have to indicate that you are a convicted felon, a lot of times you would not get that denial until after the interview process. So it can be frustrating. The men and women that I work with, the one thing I tell them is your past does not define your future. What you've been through, where you've been, that may make your path, maybe have some more turns in it. Maybe there's other doors you have to go through, but really, uh, in today's, employment field, there are places that are willing to work with men and women that have a felony conviction.
So with that, what is your take on why that paradigm shift has taken place? And I'll give you a for instance. In the military, we go through ups and downs, swings through the recruiting cycle. When the economy is good, things are running on all cylinders, jobs are plentiful, recruiting is down because young men and women coming out of high school or coming out of college see that there's an opportunity to be employed and to stay close to home or close to their friends. And so they choose not to go into the military, or fewer choose to go in times where the economy is rough and that there aren't a lot of jobs that are readily available. We see an uptick or a surge in recruiting because young people coming out of high school or college see that it's really tough to get jobs, and they know that they have a chance to get employed if they enlist or join the military. Do you think the economy has anything to do with the employment of people who have been justice involved, or is it a switch in how society is taking a look at the person who is justice involved or has substance use disorder?
So I think, John, there's a lot of contributing factors, and some of these are even, pre-COVID. I think that the stigma associated with somebody being a convicted felon has start to, be reduced. That employers are realizing that, the only difference between your average person and somebody who may, have been convicted of a felony could be one bad choice. And even if it's somebody that's had, a couple of convictions, maybe have, like myself, who served some time, that the whole point of rehabilitation is somebody has made that bad choice, they served their time, they're being reintegrated into society, and if they're not afforded an opportunity to be a productive member of society, that creates a higher, percentage of recidivism, people that are likely to reoffend. And so, and I'll be honest, John, a lot of the guys and gals that I place, with these local employers, uh, probably 95% of them are still at that same position and have turned out to be, outstanding employees. Like they're showing up on time every day. They're hard workers, so a big part of it is just the stigma of being a felon is being reduced. And I think too that through COVID, once we kind of made it through that whole situation, there just was not a lot of people to hire. People were working more from home. Um, a lot of people just the employment pool went way down. So employers are like, well, what's our other, demographic? How else, who else can we hire? And now that they begin to overlook some of that criminal background, they're realizing that some of these folks are their best employees.
Well, that is really encouraging because, as you well know, the stigma that's associated with this disease. Uh, Still, we're fighting within society, within various sectors of the society, this idea that substance use disorder, addiction, alcoholism is really a moral failing. And if the person really, really wanted to get sober or clean, they could with just a little bit of discipline and a little bit of willpower. And of course, as people in long term recovery, we know that it is just full of it. and that it
Right.
is a disease. It's a disease that is marked with the phenomenon of craving and obsession, which leads the alcoholic, leads the person who's addicted, leads the person who is suffering from a substance use disorder to do things that, in spite of overwhelming consequences, in spite of terrible consequences on them personally or their family or their finances or their standing in the community or their standing with the Justice Department or law enforcement, that they repeat these things over and over again because of that obsession, because of that craving. And so, what I hear you saying is that the employment of justice involved in individuals uh, is partially related to a reduction in that and also partially related to the economy. Somebody
Yeah.
once said that necessity is the mother of invention. And so, with these people who are willing to work and with a reduced stigma associated with it, employers are now more willing to hire people who are justice involved. Is that a fair summation?
Absolutely. Yeah. I know, there are some employers in the local area here that up until the last so many years would not even consider even interview somebody with a felony and now are hiring felons. And like you said, I think there's a lot of reasons, but economy is a driver for sure. And again, like employment pool, who's available.
Yeah, it takes a concerted effort on so many people's parts. In the last couple of episodes, we've talked to people who have been involved with the legislative side. Tom Emmer was a guest on the program, and he talked about what he's doing as a congressional representative in the House of Representatives to get this issue in front of the nation to make sure that people are being treated in a humane fashion, that they have access to treatment, and that a substance use disorder is a very treatable disease. Our last episode, we had John Magnuson, and John Magnuson worked very closely with another member of Congress in getting the Parity Act through, which allowed third party payers, required third party payers to treat substance use disorder treatment just like they would if they somebody needed surgery. And so the idea was that there would be parity, right? If they were paying for surgery, they're going to pay for substance use disorder. And they can't just say, oh no, we're going to pay for one and we're not going to pay for the other. And so these efforts in our society have helped to reduce that stigma, that shame that's so associated with the disease, thereby making it much easier for the transition of somebody coming out of our Justice Department, our Department of Corrections, run-ins with the law, and making that transition now into civilian life, into the economy, a much smoother and much easier transition. Sean, you do a lot of work with people who are justice involved in transition fairs. Can you explain that to our listeners and what that's like?
So what I do currently here for the Recovery Community Network is I was hired under a grant. It's called the COSSIP grant, and that stands for the Comprehensive Opioid Stimulant and Substance Use Program. So the Bureau of Justice basically put out, a grant for folks like myself that have a justice involved history, because the feeling is that somebody who's been there, somebody with lived experience, is able to make that connection with men and women who are currently experiencing incarceration. So currently, I go into all the Minnesota Department of Corrections facilities, Moose Lake, Willow River, Faribault, Lino Lake, Stillwater, and I do what they call a transitions fair. So this is uh, multi-booth. You come in, there's probably 50 vendors there. They're all different employers, healthcare providers, housing, providers. I go in for the Recovery Community Network and reach out to men and women that are going to be transitioning back into society, to help connect them with a certified peer recovery specialist to help kind of navigate the things that they're going to encounter upon release. And really the hope is just to reduce that recidivism, to get them out there, to help them find stable housing, help them find, gainful employment. Most importantly, help them navigate that path to recovery. Now you're incarcerated. Once you get released, that's when a lot of those things are going to hit you, and it can be overwhelming. So to have somebody who's been through that, that can maybe help you figure out your release plan, and are you actually going to put it into effect? All the great plans in the world mean nothing if you don't put them to use. So that's one of the things that I do, is make sure that they have somebody they can connect with. Uh, like myself, I've been through that multiple times. I know what it looks like to do it successfully, and I also know, what it looks like to do it, racked with failures. And so I try to help that man or that woman understand that, these are the things that are going to help you be successful.
You know, when I was deployed to Iraq, when I was deployed to Bosnia, we would often joke that the only difference between us and prisoners was that we carried guns. But otherwise, we were supervised 24/7. We had the crow nests, we had the machine gun towers placed in 4 places around the compound. We were told what to wear. We got 3 hots and a cot. Um, and a lot of our civil liberties, because we're in a deployed environment, are taken away. And when you get into that kind of regimented routine where you're constantly being told what to do, you're constantly being told where you can go and where you cannot go, and then you come out of that, it is a huge transition. And the parallel that I'm making is that that transition is very much what somebody who's been incarcerated is going through. They have been in a situation where their civil liberties have been taken away. They're in a situation where they're being told what to do. They're supervised. They're looked at. They're poked and prodded. And then suddenly they're released, and they're released into the community. And that transition must be very, very hard. What are your thoughts on that?
It is. So, my longest period of incarceration was the last time that I had served, and I was inside the walls for 5 years. Um, when I got released, and this last time was from Lino Lakes, and I had been working on a work crew that actually went out into the public. It was called an STS crew, Sentence to Serve. So I had some exposure, but it's again, you're not left alone to figure everything out. You're still, they're telling you when to wake up, they're telling you what to wear, that type of thing. When I got released, I had a family member drive me over to Walmart. So something that is just average, everyday business for your normal person. I walked into Walmart and I was completely overwhelmed. It was my daughter that had picked me up, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to run there. I'm going to grab a phone. I'm going to grab some clothes. I'm going to grab," and John, I walked around the store. I had, so the PTSD would set in. There's too many people around. Um, I came out of there with about a $3 bottle of bot spray. And my daughter says, "Well, where's your phone?" I said, "I couldn't do it." And I was only incarcerated for 5 years. I work with men and women who have served 30 plus years, have never seen a cell phone. The last phone they saw was a brick phone with the permanent antenna. So it's everyday little things that, people take for granted, that, that can be completely overwhelming. Um, Internet access, when you're incarcerated, you have no internet access, very, very limited. And so just for somebody to come out and somebody says, "Yeah, just fill the application out online." That person has never seen Google. They've never used the internet. So there's a lot of things that just, that people take for granted, that people experience, during that period of incarceration, that, even me today, I might not even think twice about. Um, so that's where we try to step in and just say, "Hey, it might be overwhelming. Please come in. Let's sit down together. We call it recovery coaching. But that recovery coaching that people always think, well, they're showing them how to find a meeting. Well, I mean, that's the very tip of the iceberg. For somebody who's been incarcerated, it's let me show you how to buy a cell phone. Let me show you how to apply for a student loan, or a car insurance, or you know all these little things that are just second nature to people. These are challenges that somebody who's been incarcerated might need help with.
That is a really interesting insight and similar to your experience. When I came off of my last deployment, uh, my wife picked me up. I had been separated from my group because I had to do some additional training. And so I wasn't part of the big, like, coming home party and stuff. She just picked me up individually at the airport and we went home. And I was still wearing my uniform. And I think she had some function that night with friends, a little coming home dinner. And I went into my closet and I was overwhelmed. There were all these like colors, and I had been looking at
Right?
camouflage
Fatigues, right?
last year. And I was like, I don't know what goes together anymore. I'm like, honey, can you pick out an outfit for me? Because I am just overwhelmed with all the choices here.
Right. Yeah, when the military gives you one choice, it really kind of makes it easy. Well, I guess I'm wearing this today.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So it's really interesting, and the easier that we can make that transition, we've learned that in the military. Uh, you know, I've talked to Vietnam vets. Their transition period from Saigon to San Francisco was 72 hours.
Yeah.
They were told that they were being out processed. They got on a plane in Saigon. They got back to San Francisco. They were mustered out. And the next thing that they know, they've been given their mustering out pay and a train ticket to get back to their place of location. There was
Right.
nobody to tell them, hey, in the next few days, you're going to be going through this. You're going to have some reorientation issues. Things are going to be strange. Things are going to be awkward. Things are going to be odd. The society has changed. These are things to look out for. These are things to be aware of. There was nobody to do that. We have
Yeah.
learned in the military now that we don't do that to our guys and gals coming home, that we have a transition program, and you work in that. Uh,
Yeah.
what are the what are some of the good news stories that you've seen? Now, this isn't just a program that you're doing here in St. Paul. This is a national program. You talked about a grant that you received. That was a Department of Justice grant, so it was a
Yeah.
federal grant. What kind of success stories have you seen come out of the work that you've done, Sean?
So I think to date, I have worked with about 150 men and women. Some, a lot more closely than others. Some are just brief contacts through what it's called JPay, where I can message them inside of the prison. But I would say meaningful work, one-on-one work, probably with about 40 men and women who have been released. And a percentage of that population is also veterans. And I've helped them secure employment. I've helped them find housing. There's probably a handful of men and women that we have actually helped either get training inside the prison as a certified peer recovery specialist, or shortly after release, we put them through what we call the Recovery Coach Academy. Um, and that I'm telling you, it gives them purpose. Rather than just, getting out, being released, probably the same as, the military used to be. Well, good luck. Now they have someone that they can go to, someone they can reach out to. If they, we have a release support group. So we have an online Zoom group, also in person down in Mankato, that if they need somewhere to go and sit down and just talk to other men and women who have experienced that same situation, they can be involved with it's called the OID No Longer Me. We have one gentleman that was released, long-term incarceration. We helped him get into an aftercare program. We helped him secure some housing it's called sober housing, where it's a house full, and in his case, it's all men that are in recovery. He stayed in that program for the duration. I think it was 6 months. became the house manager for that property and has now purchased his own sober housing through the gentleman that owned the property that he lived at, and is now managing and owning his own sober housing. And probably 20 to 30 men and women who we've helped find gainful employment that are now still employed, still in recovery, that are living in stable housing. And considering that the recidivist, the rate that people would go back in is in the high 50s to 60s. Just out of that group, maybe two individuals that I know have had a couple of bumps in the road, and even that's changed. So prisons, probation and parole now, if in the past, if you had a bump in the road, they were very quick to put you back in. Now we find, through the partnerships we formed with like the Department of Corrections parole people, Stearns and Benton County, that they'll reach out to us here at Recovery Community Network and say, hey, I'm working with somebody who's struggling. How do we get them back on track? So rather than it being punitive and automatically you're going to go back in, they realize that it's that punishment isn't going to change anything. It just puts them back into a state of incarceration, and eventually they have to be released again and start over. So it's been there has been a more really, John, success stories than I can count of people who may not have been so successful, but with that little bit of help. And we don't do anything for them. We empower them. So when I have a man or a woman call me and say, hey, I'm getting out of Lino Lakes next week and I need help with housing. Can you find me somewhere to live? Well, what we'll do is we'll provide them with a substantial list of available housing and then help them, with the application process. But this is all things that we're teaching them to do so that they're self-sustaining. And then typically, like I say, out of all the people that I work with, just there are very few that have not benefited from the services that we've provided to them.
That is such important work, and it benefits all of us on so many levels. But the person who's incarcerated is a tax recipient, right?
Right?
I mean, because of the virtue nature of their being incarcerated, they're receiving services from the Department of Corrections, which is paid for by our taxes. When
Right?
we invest in a program like yours, we can bring that person out. We can get them into a sober living environment. We can get them a job. They start becoming self-supporting. And then from being a tax recipient, they are now a taxpayer and they're paying back into the community that is supporting the things in our community, like law enforcement, like schools, like all of the infrastructure that we need for everyday life.
Sure.
And so it is helping them individually, it's helping the community, it's helping on so many levels. And people like you and the work that you're doing, Sean, is really ground level. It's grassroots, it's in the trenches, but it's so needed and so valuable. We have about 2 minutes left in our program today, Sean. Is there anything that you would like our listeners to know that you haven't had a chance to talk about?
Well, so when you talk about like taxpayers and people, paying to incarcerate folks, that same so the MRRA came out through the Department of Corrections, and it's called the Minnesota Rehabilitation and Reinvestment Act. So as an example, they now, rather than focus primarily on incarceration, is how do we start to structure a program for that person to be released maybe earlier than they normally would, and then expire from parole earlier. But all those programs and all the things that, donations have done for the RCN and the grants that we've received have changed my life exponentially. I'm a my belief is the more that I stay involved in that recovery, the more likely I am to remain in recovery. And and I've learned this through the program that I work, is that me working with other people solidifies my own recovery. And so I'm grateful for all the opportunities, and I want to share that with other people. I want them to realize that, when your life things may have happened, your life may have been a certain way, that does not define who you are or where you're able to go. And so it's just been a real passion. And I can't thank, and John, you know that you really had a lot to do with me even kind of embarking on this whole journey. So I would say the same thing to you, sir, that I really appreciate the opportunities, and I will never take that for granted. Every day that I work, I try to figure uh, a way that I can return that to the people out there still suffering and that need that guidance. So
Well, it's much needed work and it is an incredible service to our community. But as you said, in doing that kind of work, you benefit yourself. It's
exactly.
a long-standing philosophy. It's age-old wisdom, but we keep what we have, the blessings that we have, by sharing them with others. Whether that
You're in the
is
way.
physical blessings, especially like at this time of year, homeless shelters, giving to the Santa Claus on the street, or helping out with a community meal, or it's just talking to somebody who's early in recovery and sharing those recovery stories that might get them through. I think you and I talked recently about some of the statistics. We know that the largest relapse rate is for people who are 30 days post treatment. And I would imagine it's probably 30 days post incarceration. But if you can get them to that 60-day or that 90-day spot where they are still involved, where they're still in recovery, get them hooked into the recovery community, that their chances for long-term sobriety, long-term recovery, is just that much greater and that much more predictable. Sean, I want
Well,
to
that's
thank you for being with us today and sharing your thoughts on recovery and the justice system and the role that that plays in recovery.
absolutely, sir. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing with us today. It was really a fascinating conversation. And to our listeners, thank you for spending a little time with us to learn more about Veterans for Recovery. This has been a podcast of the Coming Home Well Network. Until next time, be well, think well, and do well. This is Major John Donovan signing off.
You've been listening to Veterans for Recovery, a Coming Home Well podcast. We value your feedback. Please be sure to leave a review, share, and download this episode. We thank our veterans and service members for your service to our country. We thank our friends and families for their support. And thank you for listening to Veterans for Recovery.